and I've sort of forgotten it. So we're going to run it here in the theater, more or less to refresh my memory, and then if you would want to come along and see it, you may enjoy being taken back to old Spain, and we thought we'd do it today before we got to Acapulco, because there we are set to put in what you could call New Spain. And then sometime along the way, just to test your memory, we're going to play a little game in here. If you want to come along, you won't have to get up in front of your fellow passenger and show your brilliance or your forgetfulness. It's sort of called Where in the World, where we'll show a series of slides mostly from our cruise without the title, and let you guess and see how good your memory is of the spots you've seen as to where it was, in what country and what city. And it's just a lot of fun, sort of a little review of some of the places we've seen, some of the places we haven't seen. So that's coming up along the way, just so we don't all get too tired of the beautiful sun we will probably have on the way home. Well, this talk I usually call Camino Real, which means the Royal Road, and it's the Royal Road of Spain in the New World. However, it sort of should be called, I think, the closing of the circle, because we made a complete circle around the world, and as we end this talk, you will see that the circle of exploration and the circle of discovery was closed actually at the last port that we're going to visit. As we know, the great discoveries all started in Lisbon, in Portugal, where the greatest explorers either came from or started from. But actually, the beginning of our circle, if you remember way back then, started in Africa, where supposedly now the first man came from. If you've been reading the scientific papers within the last 6 months, you will see that, remember, that a very, very early ancient man was discovered in Africa, the Great Rift Valley, over which some of us flew when we went up into northern Africa. Supposedly the earliest remnants of man have now been found there, and this is a theory that's accepted that man started way back in Africa, where we visited. It was one of our second or third ports of call. And then from Africa, man split. He went in many different directions. Western man went into Europe. Eastern man set out on the long trek and the long journey into Asia. We won't go into the Dark Ages, but you remember as we've gone along in our story, after the Dark Ages, it was suddenly Western man who was trying to find the way to the Eastern man to bring back, or the Asian man we should really call him, to bring back all the wealth of the East. He wanted to find Xanadu. Remember the wonderful poem, Xanadu did Kuhlman stately pleasure dome decree. Well, Xanadu was supposedly the great home of Kuhlman. And of course, the great explorer that first went over there was Marco Polo. We talked about him before. He stayed in the courts of Cathay in China. We weren't too far from there for almost 17 years, and came back to his hometown of Venice and told the 1,000,001 stories about the Far East. Nobody believed him very much, but they believed a little bit about it, that there hadn't been pictures, there hadn't been travelogues, there hadn't been travel, and people really didn't know what to believe. Well, it's sort of like you all are going to be when you get home. I can hear the 1,001 stories that you're going to have to tell about your adventures. In fact, I've heard some of them on the ship. I've heard some of the most outrageous things on the ship already, and I can't wait to find out what they're going to turn into when you get home, about the things you saw, the jewels you bought, the jewels you didn't buy, the clothes that were there, these strange people, even some of the strange people on the ship. It's amazing how these stories are growing and growing and growing. Well, Marco Polo came home and did the same thing. The stories got bigger and bigger. He was captured, as you may remember, was put in prison in Genoa, and there Columbus grew up, the start of the Spanish story, although Columbus wasn't Spanish at all. He supposedly is an Italian. Has been always great controversy over actually where Columbus was born, but it's now generally accepted. He was born on the waterfront in Genoa, sort of pulled himself up by the bootstraps. He heard the stories of Marco Polo and the Far East. Again, just as some of your children and your grandchildren are going to hear the stories you tell, and probably the first day you're home are going to determine that someday I too am going out to see the wonderful places that my parents and my grandparents saw, and that's as it should be after each cruise. Well, Columbus was determined he was going to find these places, and also believed the theory that the earth was round. Now, Columbus didn't develop this theory at all. The Greeks had this theory about 1,700 years before Columbus was even born. It was an accepted fact that the earth was round, but nobody had been able really to prove it. So Columbus went to Portugal where the great explorations were started and was going to explore for the Portuguese. As we said earlier, if the Portuguese had listened to Columbus, he may have found the way to the New World much earlier, or he may have been sent around Africa and have just been another explorer who went the same way we did. But the Portuguese, we told the story before, double-crossed Columbus. They sent him packing on his way. So he went to the next place. He went to Spain and found Ferdinand and Isabella. First, he got nowhere with them. But finally, after 7 years of cooling his heels at the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, he convinced them that they should spend a little money into exploring the New World. For two reasons. Ferdinand was a very ambitious man. He wanted power. He was marrying off his children right and left to all the various thrones of Europe to try to get Europe into one great kingdom for himself. And he also believed that there were lands over, and he knew that the East was there somehow, and he felt if he could get Columbus there and claim the land, he could indeed enrich his kingdom. Well, Isabella was quite a religious fanatic, and her great interest was not in getting money or in increasing the land, but over in the East were all of these Muslims, all of these weird, strange savages, these wonderful people whose stories she had heard about, who had to be saved for Christianity. Well, they decided to let Columbus go, and then up came Columbus with a lot of demands. He wanted to be made admiral of the entire ocean. He wanted to be made governor of all the islands he found. He wanted the power to appoint sub-governors everywhere. He wanted the salaries of all three of these people combined, plus 1/10 of everything he found. Now, this was quite a demand for a young upstart from Italy that nobody had paid any attention to. Columbus, Isabella, and Ferdinand said nonsense to all this, so Columbus was again sent packing from their court. He got out as far as the little town of Santa Fe, which our own New Mexico is named for. When the court had second thoughts, they called for Columbus and brought him back. They agreed to some of his terms. Isabella made new terms. They gave Columbus the 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, as you remember, and off Columbus started down to the Canary Islands, and that's where we left him a long, long time ago. Remember, we were about 2 months ago at the Canary Islands. It seems like 3 cruises ago, and still it seems like such a short time ago. But remember, Columbus was there and got into all the trouble with Beatrice, and we all had to go and see the house where she lived, and all the daring-do was going on. And then we left Columbus and went the way of the Portuguese around Africa and to the east. However, Columbus did set sail, and he got into the Caribbean, the Caribbean as some of you call it, where we're going to be in another week. There he stumbled onto a few of the islands. He thought he was in the New World. His calculations were, or he thought he was in the Asian world. His calculations were hopelessly wrong. And he went back to Spain with a few Indians, which convinced Isabella that further exploration should go on because there were indeed some native stevedores who needed saving. He brought back just enough gold to interest Ferdinand in financing the trips further. So Columbus went out on his second voyage and got as far as Jamaica. There he ran into the very friendly Indians called the Arawaks. The Spanish later, because they were friendly, eliminated them all in less than 100 years. There are no Arawak Indians left at all. But Columbus found the friendly Indians there. He began to learn a little bit about their language. He had taken some Indians back with him. He supposedly learned a bit of the language, learned enough that he could converse very, very roughly with the Indians. The Indians kept saying something about Khan, and pointing on towards the south. According to tradition, Columbus thought that the Indians were talking about Kuhlman, the great man whose empire he was trying to find, so he headed south from Jamaica. Actually, the Indians were talking about the Caribs, or the Carib Indians, it's a sliding of the word, who were very fierce, a very hostile tribe of Indians that lived farther south. This is where supposedly our word cannibal comes from, because these Indians were very bloodthirsty, harsh, cruel Indians that the Arawaks were afraid of. Well, Columbus, in his search for Kublai Khan, thinking that this was the trail that he wanted to come on, headed still farther. He discovered Jamaica on his second voyage, and on his fourth voyage, he finally reached what is now the coast of Panama. He only went by. He didn't stop very long, but he stopped in Cuba, and of course by the fourth voyage, other ships were coming here, and in a very, very short time, Spain had started to colonize this entire area, particularly the big island of Cuba, which they used as their headquarters. Well, this brings us up to as near as 1518, when the explorer Cortez, whom you all know, sort of in your history books, a very famous and very important man in Mexican history. Cortez was living here in Cuba, and he was picked by the governor of Cuba to explore the land that they knew now existed further west, which was indeed what is now Mexico and the Isthmus of Panama and the land in there. Well, Cortez set out with about 11 ships, only 500 soldiers, and 16 horses to conquer this entire land. There have been stories about the great wealth and the great gold that the Indians had there. You who are going on the Mexican trip down to Mexico City, and many of you have been there, will see the remnants of the great Aztec Empire. Because indeed, the early Indians here did have one of the fabulous empires of the world. Untold gold, untold silver, untold pearls were here. So Cortez landed in what is now Veracruz, the great seaport of Mexico. It actually means the True Cross because he landed in 1519 on Good Friday, just about the time that we're going to land on the other side of Mexico. And in honor of Good Friday, he named this harbor Veracruz. He did then what seemed to be a very foolhardy thing. In the course of history, now he's praised for doing a very courageous thing. If he had failed, he would have been called the biggest fool in the world. He knew this gold was there. He had taken along an Indian who had been on the island of Cuba. The Indian had told them about it. The Indian could act as a translator. The Indian told him definitely that the gold was there. The Aztec people from near Mexico City sent out emissaries to greet this party with gold, with the mask of their great god, Quetzalcoatl, and also a hat full of gold dust. Well, Cortez was so intrigued by all of this wealth that he did the seeming foolhardy thing. He set fire and burned all of his ships so that his men had no way of going back to Cuba. They had no way of escaping the battles that were going to be ahead of them. And they had no choice but to stay with Cortez and fight their way through. And before too long a time, they conquered the entire Aztec nation and became themselves very wealthy people. Well, then in 1530, shortly after the Aztec Empire was conquered and the Spanish began to come more and more and more to the east coast of Mexico, Cortez headed directly south from Mexico City because he had heard there was the finest harbor in all of the coast, that is the west coast, of what was then called, because he named it New Spain. The harbor turned out to be Acapulco, and it is indeed the finest harbor that there is on the west coast of Mexico, almost the west coast of the entire northern hemisphere, the land up here. Of course, people from San Francisco will probably argue with me on that point, but nevertheless, it is a brilliant and fine harbor for ships. They went down there because they had heard of the harbor from the Indians. They found the great harbor and started the city of Acapulco as a place to build ships to go on down and conquer South America. Because down in South America, there were other Indian tribes, the Peru Indians. People down in that area, again, were extremely wealthy with the gold and the silver and the pearls. And the Spanish wanted, of course, as much of the loot as they could get. They would bring it back to the west coast, transport it across the Isthmus of Panama, transport it from Acapulco up to Mexico City, down to Veracruz, all on muleback, and ship it back to Spain and to the Old World. Well, Acapulco turned out to be this very, very fine harbor. While Cortez was developing these ships, Magellan, who you know was the first man around the world. Now, this is strange because Magellan was a Portuguese, but he was sailing for the Spanish crown. Mostly it was the other way around. The Portuguese were sending out the explorers. Well, Magellan had a big squabble with Portugal and sailed for the Spanish crown, sailed across the Pacific Ocean, discovered the Philippine Islands by accident, then went on to China, brought wealth, some of the wealth of the New World to China. And then, as the Spanish explorers began to follow Magellan, they discovered that by going a little north of the Philippine Islands, they could get the prevailing easterly wind and come all the way across and land in Acapulco. So suddenly Acapulco, from being an absolute nothing harbor that no one knew about, became the great port for the China ships. And these were the ships that came back and forth from Manila, bringing all of the wealth of the Asian world, the gold, the silver, the brocade, the pearls, the fabulous gems. In fact, exactly what we're going to be bringing into San Francisco and New York a few days from now, all of that, plus much more, were these great ships with averaging about $2 million of wealth on each ship would come in from Manila, which was under the Spanish crown, into Acapulco. Acapulco then became one of the great, well, you could almost call it the hellholes of the earth. All of the raggle-taggle people came. Whenever a ship would arrive, word would be sent up to Mexico City. Down would come the pirates, down would come the merchants, down would come all the girls who traveled along wherever there was money to be found. Down would come everybody on muleback. In fact, they would post watchers on the top of the cliffs, which you will see when we get to Acapulco, watching the horizon. The minute a China ship was sighted coming in, word would be sent to the mission. The mission would begin tolling the bells. The bells in the next church would ring. Runners would go to Mexico City, and finally the bells and the runners would reach Mexico City by the tolling and by foot. Mexico City would be warned that the great China ship was coming. Then word in the same way would be passed down to Veracruz to expect within some time a new shipment of goods going on to Spain. And everyone became very, very wealthy, and Acapulco became the most important spot in all of Mexico. Well, we'll finish Acapulco and then go to our other spot of interest. But Acapulco, finally, after Mexico and after the revolution of Mexico, actually, the great China trade began to decline. Acapulco dropped back into a little sleepy fishing village, and the mule trains, the stopped, the roads covered over, and finally Acapulco dropped into nothing but a few hundred souls living in this beautiful harbor until about 1938, when American interest came down, discovered it had some of the most beautiful beaches in the world, and built one or two of the first hotels. It immediately caught on with the international set, and now there are several hundred hotels in Acapulco, which you will see, the magnificent beaches you will visit. But from a touring standpoint, or from an old historical standpoint, don't expect very much in Acapulco at all. It was burned over several times. The old city is almost entirely gone, and instead you have the modern hotel, the modern restaurant, the very fine views, and the lovely beaches that you will see in Acapulco. So as Acapulco declined, Panama began to grow. And Panama was then used as the great base for all the wealth coming up from South America, again by the Spaniards, and it would be loaded on muleback, cross the Isthmus of Panama, about 35, 36 miles, be loaded into boats at Cartagena in South America, and go across the northern part of South America, which came to be known as the Spanish Main. Well, at this point, you can see exactly what had happened. Portugal had pretty well tied up all the routes around Africa to the New World that way. Spain was sitting entirely on the Western Hemisphere, and the ways to the wealth of Asia the other way around. Well, England simply couldn't stand it anymore. England just wasn't going to sit still for this sort of thing, because England was losing out every way she turned. England and Portugal were supposedly friends, so England didn't do too much about breaking the Portuguese trade routes. But England and Spain were at each other's throats and were mortal enemies, as much over religion. England by that time was a Protestant country, Spain was a Catholic country. There had been squabbles among their leaders about intermarriages between the kings and queens. Catherine of Aragon had gone to England, married Henry VIII, which didn't bode very much good for her. And you enter the period of the privateers, or the pirates, or the buccaneers, as they're called. You've all heard about the buccaneers. We've read about them in our history. Well, they got their name, actually, from the old word boucan, England. And the boucan was the dried meat that they used to carry with them on the ship so that they would have some meat that they could eat and have protein in their long voyages around this new world. Well, the first great privateer was Sir Francis Drake, or Francis Drake as he was called. He was on the Spanish Main, plundering all these Spanish galleons as they came from the New World with all of this gold, all of this silver, all of the pearls, all of the gems. Francis Drake, in English history, is a great hero. In Spanish history, he is one of the worst pirates that ever existed. Spain complained bitterly to England. Queen Elizabeth, who was on the throne, asked her was to call Francis Drake to England, and instead of stopping him, made him a knight, called him Sir Francis Drake, and sent him out again to search for more gold in honor of the English crown. He sacked Cartagena. He caused great problems with the Spanish, and finally, after so long, Spain was completely fed up. They went to war with England in the 1800s. If you remember, the great Spanish Armada was built, man defeated, north of Spain, and the great Spanish monopoly was then broken, and we have England entering in the picture here. England came over, took Jamaica, began to work in the colonies. So England was working farther north, and Spain was still left, except for these pirates, on her own to the south. Then came another great villain in history, Henry Morgan, probably the most bloodthirsty, blood-curdling pirate that ever crossed the border, at least according to the Spanish. According to the English, he was only a privateer taking into England what was England's due when he died. Well, we mentioned Henry Morgan particularly because he is the man that is responsible for what you're going to see in Panama. When you travel through Panama, you're going to see the new city, you're going to see the canal zone, and you're going to see Old Panama, which is quite interesting. Old Panama is nothing but a ruin now. It was the great city of the Spanish in that area, where, as I said twice before now, all the money from South America, the gold, silver, and the jewels were coming into Panama itself. Sir Henry Morgan, or Henry Morgan as he was just called at that time, went into Panama, sacked the city, and you will see the remains of the city that he ransacked completely, burned to the ground. All that's left standing are just some of the walls, some of the remnants of the old buildings. Still interesting to poke and prod around and travel through this area of Old Panama. Also in Panama, in one of the lovely churches, not too far from the Hilton, you will see the famous golden altar. It's a very beautiful altar of gold. It's the one thing that Henry Morgan missed when he sacked Panama, because the priests had the forethought, when they heard about the pirates coming in, to paint the altar, cover it with mud or paint it with black paint, so the pirates completely missed this golden altar. If you remember in Bangkok, many of you saw the solid gold Buddha. The same thing had happened during one of the many religious wars in Bangkok. The Buddha was covered with a clay covering and then just gilded with gold, so that no one realized it was a solid gold Buddha. Well, the same thing is true of the famous gold altar here in Panama. And you that have gone into the Black Sea and done some of the Eastern Mediterranean cruises on the island of what's the island? Malta. Couldn't think for a minute. On the island of Malta, there again is the famous silver gates that were covered over by the Knights of St. John when the pirates tried to ransack that island. Well, the same thing happened here in Panama, and you will see this solid gold altar, which is one of the most beautiful things to behold anywhere in the religious world, and it still is here in Panama. Well, Sir Henry Morgan was recalled again because England at that point was sort of at peace with Spain. The war had been over. Henry Morgan was recalled. Queen Elizabeth said, you shouldn't do that sort of thing. Nominally put him in prison until the whole thing blew over. Then she took him out of prison, made him Sir Henry Morgan, knighted him, and sent him back to be governor of Jamaica, where he spent the rest of his life. Well, while the English and Spanish were fighting about who was to have all the ships and who was to be a pirate to whom, the Spanish continued their settling of this land that is known as Mexico now. They started up the coast of Mexico, went from Mexico City over to the west coast and started up the famous Camino Real, or the Royal Road of Spain. Now, Sir Francis Drake, in his wanderings up and down the west coast, had landed very near San Francisco Bay. But strangely enough, in the early days, no one found San Francisco Harbor and San Francisco Bay that we're going into tomorrow. When you go in, you'll wonder why in the world they didn't, because it's one of the very fine natural harbors and natural bays in the area. No one knows really why they didn't. One theory is that there are lots of fog, that when the ships went by, because of the curve of the entrance to the bay, no one thought it was very important. But it wasn't until many, many years later that San Francisco itself was actually discovered as a good bay and harbor. But the way up started with the mission. And when you're in San Francisco, you will go to the Mission Dolores. Well, the Royal Road was really a series of missions that started first in San Diego with the first mission. 21 of them were built, 21 or 22, all the way up the western part of California. There was one in San Diego. Each mission was built about 20 miles from the other mission. So it was just about one day's journey for the people who were coming, the Spanish people who were coming in to colonize. About 20 miles away, another mission was built. And 20 miles further north, still another mission was built. These missions are a very strange and very wonderful thing in the early colonization of any new area. They were handled by the priests, so they gave protection to the Indians that were in the area. Also, these missions brought the first orange trees to California. They brought the first date palms to California. They brought the first olive trees to California. All of this is coming from Spain, you see, up the famous Royal Road. In fact, the road still exists in California as one of the main north and south highways from San Francisco on down to San Diego. They also made the first wine. 21 missions were built, and the 19th was in what is now the city of San Francisco. The little city then was called Yerba Buena, which means beautiful bird or fragrant bird, the tiny little settlement that formed on the bay of what is now San Francisco. Well, the Mission Dolores was formed there. The mission still stands. That was in 1776, the very famous date in our history. And you that are taking a tour of San Francisco tomorrow will stop and visit this famous mission. A monastery where Father Kuhlman, who was born on the island of Mallorca, got his first training. Then he came to Mexico City, and then he started building his famous series of missions. And when you're going through Mission Dolores, you will see the Spanish influence. It was Spanish architecture that was adapted in this area with adobe and formed a very beautiful and very famous early style architecture. Sunday is a very interesting trip, by the way, to take a car. You have a lot of time in California and do this Camino Real, visiting the various missions, all of which, some of them, they all stand now. Some are reconstructed, some are complete rebuilding, and some stand pretty much as they were originally. But in the Mission Dolores, you'll see one of the great Spanish missions. You'll also see a statue of Father Cunifo Serra, who started this great chain of events. Well, very, very quickly, the Spanish colonized this area. The church owned it, more or less, through the great missions. Then we go into the war that America had with Spain, with Mexico, the Mexican War. After the War of Independence of Mexico, pretty well the church support was taken away. The rancheros took over the great land. Then, after the war that the United States and Mexico had, again, there was a breaking away. At that time, a lot of Americans had come across the divide, or rather Easterners, they should be called, come across the United States. People had been crossing the isthmus, coming up by boat. And it wasn't very difficult during the war with Mexico for California to break away. It became an independent state for a very short time, or a republic, I should say, and then in 1848, it was ceded as part of the United States. It became a state in very short order after that, because you all know what was happening in California in 1848. It had broken away from Mexico, it was ceded to the United States, but no one realized that just about that time, gold was discovered at Sutter's Sawmill, and the great, great story of San Francisco began. Suddenly, the 49ers, as they were called, the men who went into the great gold rush of California, went around the Cape of Good Hope. They could buy passage that way. It was still very rough going United States. There was a lot of uncharted land, Indians to be coped with. So the logical thing seemed to be to take a boat down to Panama, where everyone knew it was a very, very narrow strip of land, cross the Isthmus of Panama, and then go north into San Francisco and make your fortune as a gold miner. The only problem was that there was no easy way across the isthmus. Now, when we get down to Panama, we're only 9 degrees above the equator again. So you will see it's going to be very hot, it's going to be very humid, and the isthmus was nothing but impenetrable jungle, a lot of malaria, a lot of disease, and a great problem of getting across. So interests decided to build a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama. It seemed as if it could be very easy to do. It wasn't very long distance that had to be built. So $1 million was raised, and the Railroad of Panama started to be built. And as we go through the Panama Canal, you will probably still see the little old cars of this old railroad still clanking across the Isthmus of Panama. In fact, when we sometimes go by ship just down to the other side and go across the Panama City back in the day, we see cars that by the old railroad, which is a great deal of fun after you're used to the heat and the dust and everything that goes along with it. You sort of feel like a pioneer. But anyway, the railroad was started. The $1 million ran out after they had completed less than 8 miles. Gold, of course, was very important, so people would come down pleading to go across Panama, and even though the railroad company didn't have any money, they conceived the bright idea of charging $5 a person to walk the 8 miles that the track had been completed, and then you had to make your own way from there on across. This revived a great deal of interest in the railroad. More capital was raised. Money was raised by actually having people walk along the railroad. And finally, the railroad was completed in 1849. Then the great gold rush people could come down to the isthmus, cross it by railroad, board boats on the other side, and go up the west coast. It's just in the reverse of where we're going to go, up to California to try their luck in the gold field. Well, the next natural development, of course, would be building the Panama Canal. It started, again, the interest was revived. There had been talk about it earlier. Interest was revived because of the gold rush. In 1880, the French Canal Company bought the rights from Colombia. There was no country of Panama at that time. Bought the rights from Colombia to build a canal across. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who built the Suez Canal, was the leader of the company. They started, they tried. It was impossible for this company to build the canal across. Again, they ran out of money. The United States decided that it would be a very good idea for the United States to have this canal. They helped foment a revolution in what is now Panama. Theodore Roosevelt was president at the time, and he claimed later that he did nothing to foment the revolution. His statement was, well, with all the revolutions that are constantly going on down in that section of the world, I just kept my foot down until it was a convenient time, then I lifted my foot and let the revolution happen, as it was bound to happen anyway. Well, be that as it may, through the negotiations and machinations, actually, of our government, Panama broke away as a separate country, and in 1904, the building of the Panama Canal began. Of course, it took many, many years to complete. The gold boom continued in San Francisco, and the little town of San Francisco grew from about 15,000 people to about 250,000 people in less than 2 years. So it became the wild, exciting, honky-tonk city that we've read about, the great waterfront, the Barbary Coast, the exciting, wonderful new town of San Francisco. About $200 million in gold actually was taken out of the area as a result of the discovery of gold. And then in 1869, when gold began to decline, another great boom came along, and the first transcontinental railroad was completed across the United States. Then, because of the natural harbor, because of the city itself, San Francisco started to grow rapidly into one of the great cities of the world today. You who have been there before, and most of us have, I'm sure, will look forward to seeing it again. If you haven't, a lot of you will be taking a tour, which is a very fine one, by the way, around the city, and you will get a look at this very fine, very beautiful modern city of San Francisco. They had a lot of problems as it was growing, as you know, mostly fires. In the course of 1 year and a half, San Francisco, the little town, the early town, burned over 6 times because it was all made of wood from the redwood forest. It was rebuilt, burned, rebuilt larger, and burned. Finally, in the early 1900s, it had established itself as one of the great cities of the United States. Then along came Clark Gable and Jeanette MacDonald about 1906. And if you remember your early MGM history, the whole city of San Francisco went up in flames while Jeanette sang beautifully through the whole thing and Clark Gable ran around being a great hero, saving everybody along the way. Well, actually, it was at that time when the great San Francisco fire occurred, and I bring it in not to make light of it because I think that's the way most of us think about the great San Francisco fire. Every time I read about it, I immediately think about Jeanette MacDonald. Actually, one of our great singers was there in the fire, as the story goes. Caruso was staying in one of the downtown hotels, and according to the legend, everybody was running out in the streets because first it was the earthquake followed by the tremendous fire. Caruso had been taking a bath, ran out on the street with nothing but his hat on, a picture in his arm, and a towel, not where it should be, but wrapped around the famous Golden Rope, and went dashing off down the street. And as I understand it, he was so frightened he never set foot in San Francisco after that. Well, San Francisco rebuilt, became the great city we know it today, and then in 1914, as I said at the beginning of the talk, the final closing of the circle took place. The Panama Canal was opened, and after 500 years of trying, there suddenly was a direct seaway from Spain, from Portugal, from Europe, and now, of course, from the eastern United States, by water, through the canal, over to the Asian world that we visited. So the circle has been completed, and when we pass through the canal, we will have completed the circle. And again, I hope you use your imagination. You see what an easy time we had. To think of these navigators in the early days that spent days. It took Magellan 100 days to cross the Pacific Ocean alone. The problems they met. The great things that we, in our own way, owe to these men for having explored this world before us by ship and by sea. Well, tomorrow morning we get into the city of San Francisco, or the Golden Gate City. One of your first, most exciting views will be the Golden Gate itself, the Golden Gate Bridge. It is the second longest suspension bridge in the world, the second longest span of suspended bridge, and the second longest main span. So just a few years ago, it held the title as king of the suspension bridges, but now I'm afraid the Verrazano Bridge, under which we passed at the beginning of our journey, the main span, it beats the Golden Gate Bridge out by 60 feet. The main span of this bridge is 4,200 feet, and the main span of the Verrazano Bridge is 4,260 feet. So you from San Francisco, sorry about that, being from New York, but that's the way the thing happens to be. Anyway, the bridge is very famous, and when you see it, stop and study it. There was great controversy when the bridge was built in 1937, or before it was built, when they were planning it, as to what construction it should be. There are great problems with the bridge because of the tremendous tides that pour in and out every day. So the problem of how to build this bridge, how to anchor it, how to keep it steady was a feat that was almost beyond the engineers. And it was at the end of the Victorian era of bridge building, when everything was very ornate, everything was very elaborate. You've seen the Brooklyn Bridge in New York with all the curfews, all the extra beams and what have you. Well, this bridge is unusual, one, because of its color, and also because of its construction. When you see the main towers, notice that almost every other bridge in the tower is full of cross beams and full of a lot of steel work that give it a very busy appearance. This bridge, the towers go up, and instead there are the big center openings that have no cross beams in them, and it gives the bridge a feeling of lightness, a feeling of airiness, a feeling of soaring up into the sky. And it's this little change in construction that has made this one of the most beautiful, I think, of all the bridges. Then, of course, if you haven't been to San Francisco before, you will want to know how to orient yourself. About everything pretty well centered as far as the shops and the main hotels are concerned around Union Square. You'll find your fine shops there. It's not too far from the pier. It's not within walking distance. You have to take a taxi cab. The downtown area of San Francisco is on a peninsula and not too tremendously large. And there, near Union Square, you'll find what to me is the most fun of all in San Francisco, the cable car. If you've seen them, been in San Francisco, you'll probably want to ride them again. If you've never been there, take a tour in the morning, and in the afternoon, then dash over and climb on the little cable car. They're unique in the world. They go tootling along. They look sort of like a circus wagon, all fancied up and painted up with wonderful names on them. And they go at a speed of 9 miles an hour. There's a cable running under the street that runs a continuous speed all the time at exactly 9 miles. And the cable car driver, or the grip man, as he officially I think should be called, has this little lever or something that when he wants to move, he grips the cable underneath, and the car hitches onto the cable and is pulled along very steadily at a speed of 9 miles an hour. If he wants to stop the car, he releases the grip, and the car stops. And even though it's on the side of the hill, they're almost like mountain goats, these cars, go up and down the San Francisco hill. They stop and are perfectly steady and perfectly safe on these very, very steep hills. So a cable car is quite an experience. There's been great controversy, as we in the United States know recently, about should they be abandoned, should they stay, and it seems that every time there's one word about the abandonment, entire San Francisco and all the romantics of the United States all rise up in arms and say we must preserve the cable car. And when you see them and ride on, you can sort of get on and off anywhere along the way. You're not supposed to, I don't believe, but if you are agile enough, you can sort of hop on as it's going by, and you too will feel, I think, that the cable cars should never be abandoned at all. You'll see the Mission Dolores that we talked about. You'll drive up to the famous Twin Peaks. Two peaks, not too far, well, not in the heart of the business center of the city, but out a little distance where you get magnificent views of the entire area. You'll stop at the Golden Gate Park, and it's a beautiful day. You will probably go into the Japanese tea garden. Now, this seems sort of silly. We've just come from Japan. Why visit a Japanese tea garden? Well, I tell you, there's a very good reason for it. It's one of the most beautiful little gardens in the world, and if the sun is out, you will see Japan in San Francisco as you should see it in Japan itself about a month from now when all of the flowers are out. This time of year, this beautiful garden is absolutely lovely. A year ago when we were here at this time, the cherry blossoms were blooming, the almond trees were out, the flowers were blooming, and it's a beautiful little Japanese garden, exactly as you would find one in Japan about 500 years ago. So it's a wonderful city to visit. One of the great cities of the world. You find very smartly dressed people because the weather never gets very hot here, never gets too cold. So you have the people always dressed rather neatly and nicely, except for the beatniks who have now moved in, but I think they're over in one section, so we won't worry about that. But the rest of the people are not the kind that you find down in Panama, where it gets so hot that you can do nothing but open your shirt and tie and sit on the curb and fan and hope for a little breeze to come along. San Francisco has an air about it, a life about it, and a sort of zest to it that you, I think, will feel when you're in this city tomorrow. Well, then we get down into a little warmer climates again. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to tell you, the value of the dollar is the dollar here, we hope, and they do take American money in San Francisco. Then we get down to Acapulco, where the value of the money is the peso, and it's about 12.50 pesos to a dollar, or each peso is worth about 8 cents. We will anchor in the bay in Acapulco. You will see the old Spanish fort that was built as protection against the British pirates, and it's a very short tender ride then into the heart of the old city. The old city itself is very small. It is changing rapidly. Now most of the old buildings are filled with gifts for tourists. You will find there all of the goods, beautiful things that are made all over Mexico are brought here for sale, because there are now many, many people who come to Mexico straight from the States down to Acapulco and then fly back to the States. They don't have a chance to travel through the country and pick up the many wonderful things that are made and wonderful things to be had in Mexico. So you will find a sampling of all of the goods of Mexico here in this resort area of Acapulco. The things to see, not too much except hotel after hotel after hotel. But there is one site that all of you who haven't seen them should see, and that site is the famous diving boys. So that site are the famous diving boys. There, I sort of got mixed up grammatically there. But anyway, there are a lot of boys, and they all go up to the top of this tremendous cliff, about 134 feet above the pounding surf below, and do these spectacular dives down into the water. They dive, they stand, and you will watch them, watching the water down below. And of course they do it depending upon the tide. But usually it's about 11 or 12 o'clock at noon, and then they dive at night, but of course our ship will have gone on by that time. But they will watch the water and time their dive so that they will hit the water 134 to 150 feet below them, just when the wave is coming in, so they have enough depth of water that they can not hit bottom. It's a very dangerous thing to do, and all the way down around them are these tremendous jagged cliffs. And one slight mismove or misdive on their part, and it would be instant death for these boys. Now, traditionally, over a period of years, this has been handed down from father to son. Now I understand the diving boys have a union, and they decide among themselves who is good enough to be a diving boy and who is going to dive at what time. They usually wait until enough people have gathered, and then they will make a dive, and as soon as the one is finished diving, one of the other boys will be around with a cap or something in hand, and you are expected to give them some money for having watched the dive. This is their way of earning their livelihood. Another nice thing to do, I found, is to sit up there at the El Mirador Hotel is one of them. There are several hotels up in the stuff. Everybody knows where the diving boys are. Go up, watch them, and have a margarita and sample the famous Mexican tequila, which is quite a drink. You've all tried the Mai Tais in Hawaii. Some of us tried them to our great sorrow the next day. We've all tried the gin slings in Singapore. Well, here is the place to try the margarita, which is the old version of the way the early Mexicans used to drink tequila. You've seen it done, perhaps, with the left hand. You take the lime juice, part of a lime between your fingers. You have a little glass of tequila here, and then salt. You down the tequila, then you take the salt, I believe in that order, and then squeeze the lime so that the taste of the tequila goes away. The effect is there that you have the lime taste and the salt, and it's a very refreshing thing. Well, the margarita combines all these ingredients with salt around the rim of the glass, and it's sort of, I'm not pushing the drinks, by the way, and I don't mean to sound like an alcoholic this morning, but it is fun to try the native food and the native drinks of all these lands. Well, there isn't too much more to tell you about Acapulco. You will see it for yourself. Then for the rest of the day, choose your favorite beach. There are dozens of them, or your favorite hotel, and enjoy yourself. Our last stop of all will be Panama. We're only going to dwell very briefly on it this morning. Panama means an abundance of fish, so the seafood is always very good down in Panama. Panama is a country to itself, so they have another currency. It's the Balboa, but it's the equivalent of $1. I think the Balboa officially is worth about $1.01. So again, you will not have trouble with your American dollars here in Panama. The ship will stop in Balboa, which is sort of a suburb of Panama City. Panama City, the main city, is not on the seacoast. It's not a port town. From Balboa, it's not too far, but again, you remember, you do have the problem of the people being mainly Spanish-speaking here, although in the shops, the better hotels, English is spoken a great deal. The tour of the city of Panama is a very fine one. I suggest if you haven't been in the area, it's the easiest way to get around. You go out to Old Panama, New Panama, you see the Canal Zone area, and then there will be time for shopping in Balboa. In the evening, if you are on the evening tour, it again is a very interesting tour. Fine dinner, one of the fine clubs with a beautiful Panamanian show, the costumes, the colors, and the dances of this interesting land of Panama, which the United States helped create. I'm not going to take time at all to go into the Panama Canal itself and a story about that. As we transit the canal, as a service from our government, one of the guides of the Panama Canal Zone will come aboard the ship and will narrate, as we are all out on deck, as we will be, our transit through the canal. It is a service that our public information center in Panama offers, and the guides are excellent. They will be on the public address system and will be narrating the facts, the figures, and the historic, wonderful stories about the building of the canal itself. All I want to do is tell you, in case you get all mixed up going through the canal, do most of you realize, I hope you do for this time, that to get from the west to the east in the canal, you go from the east to the west, because the canal actually runs north and south. Now, if you're thoroughly confused by all of that, it's that if you study your map, the end of the canal that is what we think of as the eastern part in the Caribbean is actually farther west than the western part, which is in the Pacific, because the whole land does an S-turn and the canal is built backwards through the bottom S. But all of these are interesting facts and interesting stories that you will get as we transit through the canal itself. Well, I always hate to say goodbye. I'm not going to dwell on it because I sort of get very sad when I do, particularly since today a lot of you who have gotten to be very, very good friends are leaving the ship. All I suggest is that it's about noon. We've sampled Mai Tais. We're going to sample margaritas. We've sampled lots of things around the world. And I think it might surprise most of you to know that today is the day to go to the bar and get yourself a martini, because the martini was invented in San Francisco, and it was named for a tiny little town outside of San Francisco called Martinez, where the bartender came from. So happy martini to you, and enjoy this wonderful round of